Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Raw Men. What is this, like 55, 56, I think now? And today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be interviewing a rapper, an atheist rapper in Canada. This is Baba Brinkman, who did a rational rapper, peer-reviewed rap material? Was that the way you presented your material?
Yeah, peer-reviewed rap is my brand. It's always as rational as I can possibly make it. But as a Homo sapien, I'm sure that's fraught with all kinds of biases anyway. But I try to look through those lenses when interpreting the world in my rap. And I should point out as well that I'm actually in New York, but I'm originally from Canada.
Okay, don't all Canadians move to New York?
Seems that way, doesn't it? Yeah.
I think it's a requirement if you're Canadian and you want to be famous. You move to New York.
Well, that's a good introduction to me.
Well, very good. So I saw a couple of your videos, and the first question that I have, one is why are there so few views? Because that rap is not my thing, but that's pretty good stuff there. And the video editing, do you do that yourself?
No, I work with animators and producers on the videos, and yeah, I mean that rap is supposed to be a pretty popular viral art form, but yeah, my biggest videos have maybe 120,000 and lots of them are in the tens of thousands. And I don't know, maybe I need a better PR team, or maybe there's something about science-based rationalist hip-hop that creates a disconnect for people or something.
I think that's really what it is, because I've seen some exquisite documentaries, for example, and the views would be listed in the hundreds. Yeah, but if you've got something of some cute kitten, then that's in the tens of millions of views. Yeah. So there's the disparity there. But what I wanted to say was it was really well edited, and it looked like good stuff. It looked like good material. So I would be happy to promote it as best I can. What humble effect I can have on that. I want to ask how you got started on all this.
Well, so I'm a bit of a shapeshifter. Rational rap is not where I started. I kind of shunted my way into that. But the first project that I did, I actually did a master's in comparative literature in university. And I was studying the Canterbury Tales for my master's. So I wrote a rap adaptation of the Canterbury Tales, partially just because I thought that the stories seemed extremely relevant and contemporary. Lust and greed and jealousy and the 7 deadly sins and betrayal and avarice. And, it's just really like this palette of human foibles and the core stuff that still drives drama today. So I started rewriting those stories into raps. And for the first 4 to 5 years, I was just known as the medieval rapper guy. So I was just rapping Chaucer and sort of bringing it back. And then at one point, I did my Canterbury Tales show at this university in Britain, where there was an evolutionary biologist, and he saw it and he said, if you can do Chaucer, could you do Darwin as a subject? So I wrote this whole series of songs about natural selection and sort of modern interpretations of evolutionary theory, and that process, I guess, made me a spokesperson for the secular worldview, which Darwin is pretty central to, because without him you can't explain much when it comes to design in the natural world, or the appearance of design. So yeah, it was funny because, when I started that project, I was just like, I'm an academic that uses rap to communicate complex subjects. But I had never heard of anything like the skeptic community or anything like that. I didn't even really self-identify as a skeptic.
Were you still in Canada at that time?
Yeah, I was still in Canada. I moved to New York about 5 years ago. So this was, say, 2008, 2009. And when I put out this album of Darwin-themed rap songs, which was very pro-evolution, sort of unequivocally like creationism is bullshit kind of mentality, and here's all the reasons why, a lot of the response I got was, you're speaking for us, the free thinkers. And I was like, what's a free thinker? So then I sort of had to start from scratch but a lot of the people I've met through this sort of rationalist, humanist, atheist, these networks, that I feel like they're kindred spirits. So, I wouldn't have even claimed atheist before I put that record out. It was really sort of engaging with some of the arguments. I think Dawkins in The God Delusion sort of really made a good case for, if you're an atheist, it's important to say you're an atheist because of the persecution that's sometimes social and subtle, like no one gets elected who's an atheist in this country, or sometimes death sentences in lots of Muslim countries. So, for that reason, just like coming out as gay, I thought, all right, I'm going to come out as an atheist then. And now I can claim to be an atheist rapper, although atheism is not the majority of what I rap about.
Well, I'm a strong advocate of the Atheist Out program, and for the reasons you just described, because we are, the sad thing is that so many of us, and I bring this up every time I talk to anybody, it seems lately, I've noticed that polls will show that people will admit to being atheist, it's only like 3%. But the descriptions they give them themselves that clearly define them as atheists just without the label is at least a quarter of the country. And if by extension, I've met a number of people who identify as Christian, various denominations or what have you, as well as Jewish and Hindu and others. But I've met people who identify as Christian, even though they admit that they don't believe in the scriptures and they don't believe in any God. So I'm thinking, that's atheist, not Methodist.
Yeah.
So I think that we are actually a third of the country that is atheist. So very few of them are activists. Most of them are apatheists. But the thing is that we are all being oppressed. We're all being forced to consider, the possibility of having Mike Pence as our vice president, for example. And this is what happens when you're underrepresented in the political scheme. Nobody takes you seriously, and nobody's going to consider the value of your vote. Certainly no one is going to pander to you because you aren't a significant enough demographic. And I would argue that that realistically, I suspect, and I'm attempting to prove, that atheists outnumber Catholics in this country. And I think I can demonstrate that to be the case.
Right. Well, this phenomenon that we're discussing of sort of mistrust or aversion around the term atheism, that was something that I just sort of took as a given, like, okay, we got to push back against that because it exists. But in one of my projects, Rap Guide to Religion, when I was researching that, I actually came across a sort of very persuasive evolutionary theory for why atheist mistrust would have taken hold so strongly and why it persists. And it's this idea, I think it's Ara Norenzayan at the University of British Columbia. The simple version is one of the sort of cultural drivers of evolution's or of religion's sort of dominance in past has been around creating common beliefs that create group cohesion and become a badge of trustworthiness. So believers can trust other believers, and therefore they can overcome barriers of, like, who do I trust to trade with, or entrust my family to when I'm traveling, things like that. But among those groups where common belief is the signifier of trust, being an atheist would have literally been an admission that you're not trustworthy. Of course, the context has changed a lot. We have laws, we have government systems, we have checks and balances that keep people from behaving selfishly in a way that probably past environments didn't, and lots of developing countries today don't. But one of the predictions of that view of why religion evolved sort of culturally and evolutionarily is that the more strongly you rely on God to sort of reinforce your system of morality, which it can function that way in some contexts, the more mistrusting you should be of atheists, because atheism sounds to you then like an admission of anything goes in the moral sphere. Now, to an atheist like myself, that argument feels flimsy as hell. Like, of course, there's lots of reasons why I don't go around killing people, and they're probably the same reasons a Christian doesn't. They just use the word God as a sort of like super category, but really it's probably fear of jail and rejection by your entire family network that is a stronger incentive. And yet, at least then, mistrust of atheism doesn't just look like an arbitrary injustice. It looks like something that's sort of part of our the sort of psychological modules that hold religion also hold that mistrust factor. And that's, that at least gives us a sense of what we're fighting against and pushing against when we're looking for justice.
Well, it's also cultural conditioning. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the interview with Steve Harvey, where he says, if you're an atheist, then where is your moral barometer, right? So many people were raised in this country to believe that atheists somehow have no moral guidance, right? And obviously to unbelievers like ourselves, we're aware of all of the reasons that we behave the way we do, and in fact that even if there wasn't a police force threatening our liberties for the rest of our lives, would we be running around killing and raping like the Christians all say that they would if they thought that there was no God? Even without a police force, we still would not act that way. So I mean, it's our natural humanity, our humanism, if you will, that is preventing us from being this way. And this is a product of our being evolved as a social animal. We just don't make up excuses of a God, for why we act like we're supposed to.
Yeah. Well, I'm a little bit more of a skeptic than you in this sense, in a way, because I'm not sure how everyone in my neighborhood would behave without a police force. You know what I mean? Like I know what civilizations that degrade into anarchy end up looking like, and it's more like Game of Thrones than like the world we live in. And the person who says I'm a humanist, therefore I wouldn't go around murdering without the police, may be kidding themselves. In fact, it depends on who's trying to kill you and what your family depends on. And, I'd like to think I would maintain a strong moral compass, but I bet you some of the bearings would shift if it was like chaos and death right outside my door. So, I don't put myself above the sort of situational responses, the survivalist responses that people in all societies throughout history who have had to deal with really tough situations have ended up sort of resorting to. But I also don't think that any of that stuff comes from God. I think as a species, we've evolved to be aggressive and cruel in some contexts, and we've evolved to be humanistic and altruistic in other contexts. And part of what we're doing with modern civilization is creating the social context and structures and sort of apparatus scaffolding that allows us to express our better angels and suppress our worst devils of our nature. And I think that's a very good project, because the devils come with us. We just, we can just like find ways to trigger them less often.
And for those who don't understand the reference to devils, you're obviously referring to Steven Pinker.
Yes, absolutely. Very influential thinker on me, for sure.
Yes. So your mention of that completely threw off where I was going. Oh, yes. I was speaking personally. I mean, I don't, under any circumstances, I don't derive pleasure out of cruelty to other people. I have some degree of empathy. It's not a very high degree, but I do have some degree of empathy. And I don't like to hurt other people. So when people talk about, running around, killing and raping and all of this, as if, having no God means that you're supposed to enjoy this kind of abrupt violence against other people for the sake of the fun of cruelty, I don't get that message. I can't share it. I understand there's a hell of a lot of people who do, but I was speaking personally.
Well, here's a question for you then. Can you see that there's a kind of logic to it, though? Can you appreciate the logic behind that claim?
No.
Okay, I really can, actually, because I think it kind of depends on a bunch of ifs. Like I don't think the Christian that makes that claim is necessarily keeping those ifs in mind, but you could say, like, if the rule of law is very ineffective in keeping people in check, and if people literally believe in a literal God that will literally send them to hell if they're bad, in that context, the belief in that God will actually stand as a good predictor of whether you do good or do bad acts. Now I think in today's society, take those ifs away, because we've got a good rule of law, and we've got a lot of people that claim to believe that aren't really believers. And, is it really holding people back? I don't know. You see a lot of malfeasance in churches as well, right? But if you fulfill the ifs that the state's not taking care of you, believers actually act on their beliefs, and their beliefs give them incentives to do what the Bible tells them, a lot of which is horrible, but some of which, like love thy neighbor and be compassionate and things. You know what I mean? Like I can see a context in which the belief that non-believers will behave worse than believers, I can see a context in which that makes sense. I just don't think it's this context.
I think there are three problems with the analysis you're giving me, and one of them is that statistically, we've seen that evangelical fundamentalists, the extreme religious types, tend to be the ones that promote executions and torture of prisoners, and that they're the ones that are most commonly associated with child molestation and even with abortions, and just like every kind of negative social demographic, the fundamentalists lead atheists. The non-believers, the non-religious, however they identify, the nuns, are always on a more passive demographic, where the recent studies, for example, that I keep seeing fluttered all around, that atheist children are less cruel and more generous and so forth. I mean, we beat the religious right on so many statistics as far as morality goes.
We do now.
We do now. Then there's also
doesn't mean we always did.
Then there's also, as you mentioned before, I mean, if the people really believe in God, there's going to punish you for being bad, then why you have all of this criminality in church? I mean, like the Catholic Church just acquitted a guy who was being prosecuted for raping 30 preteen kids. You know, and they could, why? Because the Catholic Church can just do that, and that's what they've always done. So that's what they're going to continue to do.
If you want a diagnosis for that, I would say probably the degree of sexual repression and social conservatism in churches creates a strong sort of pressure valve effect that makes people act out in much more negative ways in comparison to social contexts where it's sort of like do what you want as long as you don't hurt anybody, and then you sort of have a healthy sexuality and it doesn't manifest itself in those sort of perverse acting out kind of ways. I would say I don't know that it's necessarily the religious beliefs that are causing the pedophilia. I'd say it's more like the sexual repression and social conservatism that is. Anyway, I don't see a logical connection between the sort of between the dogma and that kind of perverse behavior. Maybe I've missed something.
No, I agree with you that it's the that it's the conservatism and the imposed practices, on denying the priests sex for the rest of their lives. They're going to have sex. It's a natural drive. It's a fundamental drive, and in many species, sex overrides everything else. So if you take away somebody's ability, their ability to have that aspect fulfilled in any capacity, then it's going to come out in some devious distortion.
Yeah.
And maybe there are deviants that got into it for that reason too. Whatever. There's another problem in that the God, there's a misunderstanding of theology in that the Christian concept of God, at least, does not send people to hell for being bad. There's only one thing that will guarantee you going to hell, and that's not believing. Because it doesn't matter how good you are. If you're an atheist, you're going to hell. And if you're a Christian, it doesn't matter how bad you are, because everything can be forgiven, all sins except the sin of disbelief. So gullibility is the sole criteria for redemption, and that's the thing that will get you damned. The third thing that I wanted to mention is there was something that was realized with the Clergy Project. Now, you're familiar with the Clergy Project, yes?
And then
Okay, so what the Clergy Project had noticed is that when believers, like when priests, that's what the Clergy Project is for anybody that doesn't know, it's when priests realize they no longer believe their own bullshit. And here they are committed to this job that they've been doing. They've been working for their various churches for perhaps decades. They don't have any skill set anywhere else. Maybe they still feel a value to their community, as many of them do. Some of them still practice. I mean, apparently there is a list of hundreds of them that are still behind the podium now, even though they know they're lying to their congregations.
And if any religious people are watching this broadcast, it could be yours.
Very likely. So one of the things that they noticed, though, is we've all seen famous examples of the hateful theists, like the John Hagees and that guy in Phoenix, who says that, if the Bible says that slavery is okay, then slavery is okay because the Bible is never wrong. People that make these kinds of hateful statements.
Westboro Baptist Church.
Exactly. And they may be being true to their theology for the kind of things that they say. But what we've discovered is that when people no longer have that belief, there's a strange correlation in that they start voting more liberally and they start expressing a lot more tolerance. They don't retain that level, at least, of right-wing hatred. Mm-hmm. There's a trend, and it's not true in all cases. There are atheists who still have these kinds of tendencies too, but what they've seen is a tendency that these people, when they lose their belief, they tend to lose a lot of that hatred, a lot of that social conservatism. They become more tolerant. So when they talk about, if there wasn't a God, then I would be running around killing and raping and all like that. No, if you realize that there was no God, you'd actually be a better person.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. But I think that actually fits the description that I was presenting, because what it predicts is that people will rely on religion for their morality until they lose their religion. And then they're going to rely on humanistic structures and social institutions for their morality, or at least to be sort of like props for morality. And that directly predicts that people who lose their religion will vote more liberally, because voting more liberally means strengthening social institutions and government institutions that are able to serve as incentivizers of moral behavior, whereas people who are more religious should think, well, God can do it, so we don't need government to do it. See what I'm saying? So that it kind of but the belief that we need God to enforce morality creates a mistrust of atheists, I think, logically. I think showing people what you are describing, especially the stuff around like the lowest religious societies are the ones with the greatest well-being indexes. It shows that the less religious we get, the happier we get, and the more cooperative and sort of pro-social we get as a society, which means you're right. They're totally wrong that if you lose God, you act worse. If you lose God, you act better. But yeah, statistically speaking, but I can think of a social context in the past where that better action would not have been incentivized by good social and institutional structures. There was no rule of law for those who left the church. Therefore, those who left the church could be counted on to behave however they wanted. You know what I mean? Because there would be no other thing keeping them in check. They would have lost community. They would have lost the sort of moral framework of what keeps people good. And I think the belief that atheists will be bad is a sort of throwback to those ancestral communities where it was true that someone needed to be a believer for you to trust them. Even if that was an imperfect metric, it was better than any other they had available, because citizenship didn't mean that much.
Now, I'm curious about what was your goal when you were going for your master's degree? Where did you expect to be?
Well, I think I started with this idea that rap as an art form was the natural inheritor of Chaucer, Shakespeare, Homer, Beowulf, William Blake, John Donne. Like, I studied the literary tradition, and I was like, they're genius poets up until a certain time, and then what happened to the lyricism? Why is all modern prose free verse and aimed at publishing rather than like lyrical performance for an audience? And I sort of had this aha moment where I was like, rap has taken up the fallen gauntlet of what poetry always was. So I wanted to do a thesis that showed a natural connection between the oral traditions, the storytelling traditions, the rhyming traditions, and what rap has become. So, that was my master's, basically a sort of like a convergent cultural evolution thesis about how poetry in the Middle Ages is way more similar to what rap is today than to a lot of the intervening literary published poetry. Even though we think of poetry as one thing and rap as another, actually rap is more like 500 years ago poetry, and a lot of the stuff in between is dissimilar to either. So, to sort of make that point, I rapped the Canterbury Tales as a performance to sort of show how compatible they were. And
so
then
you're saying you didn't adapt it, you didn't write a rap version of the Canterbury Tales, you rapped the actual Canterbury Tales.
No, if I had rapped the actual Canterbury Tales, no one would have had a clue what I was saying.
Okay, that's where I was going with that.
I rewrote it. Basically, all of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales come from earlier sources. So he adapts Petrarch and Dante and folk tales from his time and stuff. So basically, like, I did to Chaucer what he did to Petrarch, rewriting it into a contemporary language. That for me was just a project of showing how literary traditions have universal sort of timeless appeal. And also rap is an art form that deserves way more sort of credit artistically and literarily than it gets. But then I also sort of hit on, and rap is, a potent way of telling a story and delivering a message, even a complicated message. And I guess that's what set me up to do this thing, which I've done more recently, which is this whole series of rap guides to things, most of which were started when some academic reached out and said, I have this really great research project. People should know about this. Could you create a rap album that communicates it to the public? So I think I've done 7 rap guides to various subjects: evolution, religion, climate change, like biodiversity and wilderness, medicine, and each of them are sort of like, here's a field of science, and here's why it's sort of relevant and fascinating using rap as a vehicle to get it out there.
So you were a performer in the Reason Rally, correct?
Yes. Well, technically, I couldn't get on the main stage. I lobbied hard to get on the main stage, but they didn't give me the slot. But they did give me my own sort of show the day before the main rally. So I had a sort of like I was the night before the rally entertainment for the Reason Rally.
Well, that was with the comedy acts as well.
It was on the same night as the comedy acts, but it was in its own venue, and I was performing the Rap Guide to Evolution there.
Ah, okay, that's why I missed it. We were in the other hotel. I mean, it's funny how they had that event divided between 2 different nights in 3 different venues. So there was so much stuff to put in one place, I guess.
Yeah, it was a great group of people to share the space with. Inspiring event, and it was great to be part of.
So what else do you do? You said that atheism isn't the only thing that you do. What else do you do?
Well, like, I mean, atheism is a very small percentage of what I do, but it kind of follows from a lot of this stuff, because one of the main things that I sort of made my signature calling card is evolution advocacy. So understanding evolution, not just, cavemen and dinosaurs, but evolutionary psychology, human behavior, cultural evolution, evolution of religious, cultural, social systems, looking at the human body as an evolved organism that has trade-offs in its history that can help us understand what disease is, like what is cancer from an evolutionary perspective. Okay, then what is gangster rap and violence from an evolutionary perspective, a la Steven Pinker? What about cooperation, altruism? But I think the better you understand evolution, the less room there is for a God that does any interesting work. A lot of the things that religious people assume God did, there's actually a better scientific explanation. So atheism is kind of a fallout of what a lot of what I do, atheism sort of proceeds from it, but I'm not up there saying there is no God. I'm up there saying, look at how amazingly powerful the explanatory framework of evolution is. I'm about to show you things about the world that will make you go, oh my God, I can't believe I never thought of that before. That now makes sense when it never did. And at the same time, as a fortuitous side effect, your faith is being eroded.
One of the problems that I find, the people that I deal with who are, with believers, is they use the anecdotal deviation or exception as their only connection, which to what I'm trying to discuss is actually, statistical trends, and people can't seem to get statistical trends. Well, yeah. if your Aunt May isn't like that, or if your Uncle Bob isn't like that, well, then all the statistics are incorrect. In understanding evolution, for example, the things that I typically hear, is why doesn't an animal just grow wings to escape from predators if they need to? Just say, I need to grow wings, and grow wings. That's how bad the misunderstanding is.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely an uphill battle, but those kind of questions are relatively easy to answer. It is the sort of behavioral, like the stuff that we're talking about how certain kinds of beliefs like atheists are untrustworthy can be predicted by a certain evolutionary model to fall out of a cultural context that we've gone through. And when a lot of people use evolution and culture as sort of alternative explanations for things, but I think that's really a mistake. Like culture is an evolutionary process. People are trying modes of thinking, ideologies, technologies, tools. They're discarding ones that are like less functional, less adaptive in the sense of like goal accomplishing, and they're retaining others. And that sort of mimetic evolution is driving a lot of this stuff. So that is where your point about outliers becomes trickier, because there's no organism that grew wings just because it needed to, like that. So there's no reason to take that objection seriously. But there are people, let's say, who are highly religious but don't mistrust atheists. So that's where the fact of most religious people who believe in a moral lawgiver have an inherent mistrust of atheists becomes actually like a statistical generalization that is not going to be 100% waterproof, but still make strong predictions. Same with your notion, your point about religious believers in general have worse indexes on things like, let's say STDs or teen pregnancies or lots of different things, right? Well, that doesn't mean everybody's going to get one, but it doesn't mean it's not an arbitrary or meaningless point either. It has predictive power.
Yeah, but the exceptions do not make the rule.
No, exactly.
And we understand how population mechanics works, which is another thing that people very often don't get with evolution. To explain that, I like to talk about how languages evolve, because everybody understands that Latin turned into French and Italian, and they understand that there was never a first guy who spoke Italian. It's not
Right.
like there was a whole bunch of people speaking Latin and suddenly this guy's speaking Italian. And they understand the mathematics of or the population mechanics of it at that level. And evolution works kind of the same. It's analogous, but the analogy works, I think.
But they think there has to have been a first human, even though they don't think there has to have been a first Italian speaker.
Yeah. Exactly.
Although, speaking of language evolution, have you come across Tom Wolfe's new book yet?
No.
Okay, this is the guy who wrote The Bonfire of the Vanities, and he writes nonfiction books as well. But his new nonfiction book is an attack on Darwin, saying that the whole theory of evolution is a theory in crisis that's based on speculation and just so stories, and it's unprovable. And yet, Tom Wolfe claims that he's an atheist, and he's not taking a religious attack on evolution. He just thinks the theory doesn't make sense, and Darwin was a sort of Victorian elitist who was just trying to justify, I don't know, like Victorian commercial norms by giving them the scientific dress of a theory and all this stuff. It's mind-boggling. I haven't read the book, but I just read a bunch of reviews of it, and I heard him speaking on NPR on the Brian Lair show, and I was just mind-boggled. I had to pull my car over to listen because I was spazzing out and thought I would get in an accident, because this is a otherwise very smart person who's a very good writer and is just like vomiting up the most incomprehensible word salads about why evolution doesn't work, which is all just creationist talking points. And yet he's saying, but I'm not religious. I just don't think it makes sense. I mean, I think it's just an iconoclast thing. He wants attention. He wants to be contrarian and seem like a provocateur. But
there's another problem that I have with convincing believers. I mean, it is the sincerity. Now I've been criticized for calling people out as liars, but when I do, it's always because I can show that person is lying. As a matter of fact, I've said many times that you should not accuse anyone of lying until you can prove that they are lying, and right then. But where was I going with this? Oh yes, you have sincere believers, and then you have people who do not care what the truth is. They just want to believe what they want to believe. Now, in the latter case, there's nothing I can do. It requires sincerity even to be worth the effort of talking to them if I'm going to be able to convince them of anything. They have to want to know what is really real. And there's a problem when you get into religion, because very big people, and I find I had to make this choice. There was things that I had been raised to believe and that I liked to believe. And then I realized that these things are not supported. And so I thought, well, maybe I can just read the sorts of things that will reinforce that belief. And I remember thinking that, just having the thought of thinking that, I realized how dishonest that would be. Mm-hmm. But I also realized that a whole hell of a lot of people have come to that same crossroads and gone the other way.
Yep. Yeah, it's a tricky one. Evolution comes back in here for me because Bob Trivers has a great paper on the evolutionary origins of self-deception. And he points out that our assumption that evolution would produce clear-sightedness and accurate intuition is actually totally fallacious. Evolution will produce the kinds of misconceptions that lead to the greater fitness of the organism. And if misunderstanding your environment or your own motives is a more effective way of achieving survival and reproduction, then misunderstanding will become the norm in a species' cognitive processes. So like the classic example is like, why don't they let parents judge kids and judge talent shows that have their own kids in them? Well, because kin selection makes it impossible to objectively judge the talent of your own child, right? But you can extrapolate that to lots of other things. And, this comes up all the time in questions of sincerity versus insincerity. And, if there's an incentive to misbelieve, if you know that people will think less of you for being insincere than for being confused, then you're going to err on the side of being confused every time. You know what I mean? So I think a lot of what people declare as insincerity is actually like willful self-deception, but it's like incentivized strategic self-deception, where you erase the awareness in your mind of the fact that you committed an intellectually dishonest move, because that awareness is too uncomfortable. Not only that, but it also exposes you to potentially being sort of outed and ostracized. So you erase it. And as long as you're not aware of it, therefore you're sincere. See what I mean? So the brain's got this sort of like self-censorship system that runs, and it erases any awareness of wrongdoing, which makes it impossible in many cases to call people a liar and be right, because they just don't know. But sometimes they know. Sometimes they know.
Yeah, I get much less an impression that I'm talking to a rapper than I am than I'm talking to an academic.
I read a lot, and and you know, I've made my project as a rapper to take the more interesting ideas from science and psychology and make them accessible, which means I kind of actually have to understand them in the first place before I can write the raps about them.
And therein lies the biggest problem that we have. And it's a cultural problem. The biggest problem that you and I have in what we want to do as far as like education advocacy is that we are in a culture that has been conditioned over many generations to, you know, over the last few generations, I should say, to celebrate ignorance. I mean, I'm in my 50s. I remember being as a child, anybody that excelled at science was made fun of.
Yeah.
And that's just, it was we don't respect academics. We don't respect science. I'm constantly listening to scientific ridicule within the culture that I emerged from. I mean, scientists, professors were scoffed. You know, I mean, if you have a blue collar job, you were respected. But if you were a professor or a scientist, or you have a doctorate, then people would just turn their nose up at you because, oh, he's got book learning, but he ain't got no common sense. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I wish that we had a more, you know, like a system where is there any way, and maybe you're working on the answer to this, of encouraging people to want to be smarter and want to understand things better?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know, I have a more hopeful vision because I know exactly what you're talking about, and I grew up around it as well, but it seems to me like it's better now. Like that there is a Facebook page called I Fucking Love Science that has tens of millions of likes, that there's you know, that Bill Nye is a big cultural celebrity that everyone wants to take selfies with, that Neil deGrasse Tyson can have a show that celebrities come on. You know, there is a sort of like geek cool that's happening right now that wasn't happening 20 years ago. And that there was a time when if you're a part of the chess club, you were straight up just like an outcast. And actually, I think in a way, knowledge is becoming cool. And partially that's not because of any PR campaign. That's just because of the dominance of tech and the fact that the Mark Zuckerbergs and Bill Gates are now like clearly ruling the world, and you got to know stuff to get there. So it becomes obvious that there's, you know, not just symbolic status in being knowledgeable, but there's actual potentially real status in it. But I think there is a sort of charm offensive side of it as well, where, you know, there's the sort of like hipster chic, or like geek is sexy, or, you know, just the sort of like, what do they call it? Sapiosexuals, you know, like talk nerdy to me, that kind of stuff, you know, that sort of meme plex of ideas around like what I'm attracted to socially and sexually is intelligence and knowing what you're talking about and being well informed, as opposed to its opposite. That has a pretty big effect. It percolates up, and it seems to be a trend that is like stable and has been, you know, building steam, and I hope it just keeps going and crests like a huge wave and just like washes the ignorance away because it becomes less and less cool.
Well, that's encouraging, and now that you say that, I think back to the 1970s and I compare the 1970s to this decade, and there is a dramatic difference, you know, in how intelligence is and was celebrated. There's a marked difference. I mean, at least there is some celebration of it now, whereas anything having to do with nerds were always socially inept Poindexters, right? I mean, just the word Poindexter, you know, it was always meant that they were going to be made fun of and they were not going to be the great successful thing. They were the minions.
Well, it also was associated, like there was this idea that the more knowledge you had, the less social graces you had, or something, that social ineptitude.
Exactly.
natural outcome of being well informed. That's why nerd has two meanings, right? Nerd means like social outcast and also really smart person. But I think dividing those two sides of the nerd meaning, embracing one and discarding the other, is a big part of the success of this. And the other thing that comes to mind is that the U.S. is behind the curve on this phenomenon. But if you go to Britain, they have there's a comedian there named Robin Ince who's been organizing these sort of atheist science comedy shows. They sold out the Hammersmith Apollo 5 nights in a row with Richard Dawkins and Brian Cox, and big musicians are playing there, and Eric Idle from Monty Python came, and but a lot of the presentations are like comedy that's taking the piss out of religion, and scientists presenting their work in an accessible way, and like you couldn't imagine a bigger platform. It's like broadcast on BBC. It's like selling out. It's like a major factor at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival now, the sort of nerd science comedy stuff. So, the US is going to have to play catch up on this, because in some other countries, like the conquest is complete, and there's no anti-intellectual dominance in the, well, I was going to say in the media, but obviously they still got their like Big Brother and Celebrity Apprentice and that kind of crap. But there is a sort of like surging underground of smart, geek, science-based comedy and entertainment and music that's coming up, and I hope that's a trend that spreads everywhere.
Well, as a cold slap of a wet hand on the trend that you were just describing, we must remind ourselves that we are currently facing the reality of a Trump presidency, or the potentiality of a Trump presidency. So, and everything that is behind that seems to represent the opposite trend of what you're talking about.
Well, that reinforces the point I just made, because Trump-like presidencies only threaten to happen in America and the developing world. There's the big in-between that seems to only elect smart people now.
Well, shortly after Brexit, they hired that Barney Rubble guy. I cannot remember his name, but I'm sure
Boris Johnson.
There you go.
Yeah.
I can say Barney Rubble, and you know exactly who I'm talking about, because it's the one guy that
Brexit is a pretty big counterpoint to it. But even Brexit, you can tell already that I'm a pathological optimist here, because if you break down the demographic trends, Brexit was old people voting to go and young people voting to stay. So if you hold the Brexit vote again in 20 years, most of the exit voters will have died, and they'll vote to come back in. It's really like, and you actually see that phenomenon with religion right now as well, right? Like church attendance is an older and older thing. Voting for the Republican Party is an older and older thing. So in a way, we can just sort of like count on progress to be achieved funeral by funeral, and try to try to maintain in the meantime.
On that note, I have been interviewing a number of people that, motivated by Bernie, are getting into politics at the grassroots level. So there is that bit of a revolution that's happening.
Yeah.
But it's still concerning to me the level of, what is it? Guttural thinking. I think I'm just going to the basket of deplorables that Hillary Clinton had mentioned. I mean, it's this aspect of our country that it is disturbing to me that it still exists, and that it exists in such a proportion. And I've seen the memes shared. There'd be a picture of Carl Sagan, and next to him there's a picture of Snooki from whatever show, I don't know, some girl named Snooki, and it says, if you know who this is, or if you don't know who this is, but you know who this is, you're part of the problem.
Yeah. I mean, the Carl Sagan's an outlier, isn't he? Because he was, he had a hit show. When was it on? Was it in the 70s or the
80s?
In the 80s, right? So, and Neil deGrasse Tyson tried to come back with it but they only got one season, and it didn't get enough ratings. It couldn't quite compete with the X Factor, and
the original Cosmos only got 15 episodes. There was only one season.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought there was multiple seasons. Okay, so then maybe it's not so bad then.
So a similar story is it. Somebody mentioned the fact that Cosmos got one season, and then this other ridiculously trite show having to do with I can't remember, some collection of bimbos somewhere. People that I don't understand why they're famous. Because they're on TV. Okay, why?
Are you talking about the Kardashians?
Yeah, that's it. That's a name I couldn't remember. Pardon.
Satan calling?
I forgot to turn my phone off. Yeah, apparently, that's my Godzilla ringtone. Anyway, done with that. So we're coming up on closing up on it, I think, and I'm going to want to put down any links to your website is already on there, but if there's any songs that you would like to have for the audience to introduce them to your work, I'd be happy to put in any number of links. If you'd like to send them to me in email, I'll put them down there.
Sure.
And is there?
Yeah. The music videos that I've released most recently that are sort of relevant to the conversation we've had are God of the Gaps and Religion Evolves. And those are both ones about like where religion comes from and how it works with society and how, how we might be able to evolve past it as a species. Those videos came out 6 months ago or so, and the new project, which is about to be released at the end of September, is a rap guide to climate change, which I called the Rap Guide to Climate Chaos, which is more just a straight up like science communication project. Doesn't really have much to do with religion, except for I do give the Pope a bunch of shout outs in it because, politics makes strange bedfellows, but when it comes to secular advocacy, I wouldn't claim the Pope as an ally. But when it comes to climate change advocacy, which I actually see as a sort of fairly crucial planetary level challenge that needs to be tackled, a lot of religious people are my allies and a lot of atheist libertarians are my adversaries. So that you'll hear a different kind of mode going on there. But I get a couple satirical digs in at the Pope's dogmas and metaphysics as well in the track. But check that out if you have a green side to you, or if you're just curious about the state of the science and politics of climate change. I break it down over the course of the record, and I'm pretty proud of it. It sort of holds up musically and lyrically. It's got turntablism on it, and the sort of mix of doom and gloom and hopefulness that you need to motivate people and make them feel the fire at their backs.
It's funny when I talk about there being no God and that when we die that there's nothing but the abyss. I have no problem with that. I mean, there's no issue at all. But when we start talking about the environment, that's so crucial, and it's such a big deal, and it's so urgent and imminent and looming that's the thing that scares me. And so it's bewildering to me that people won't see that it is even a problem. And as Ann Coulter put it, she said, putting on sweaters is not the biblical way. The gas guzzling SUV with the wet bar is the biblical way. Yeah.
Well, there's a sort of, there's an extremely unhelpful religious mentality that says, since God created us to have dominion over the natural world, and since the rapture is coming soon, therefore it doesn't matter what we do. Those beliefs are dogmatically, causing the majority of the problems. But there's also a new religious consciousness that's coming that's sort of like, we are stewards of creation. Since God bestowed us with this earth and we only have one, it's our responsibility to ensure that the majority of the created species don't die. I will take that alliance if it has a positive effect, even though I'll have some like arguments over, the details of someone's metaphysics. But sometimes I have to have a pragmatic sort of proof is in the pudding. And if those are the people that show up for the environmental town hall meetings, then I'll shake their hand and be their ally. Speaking of those town hall meetings, have you been to many other conferences besides the recent rally? Yeah, I do conferences a lot. A lot of them are science conferences, sort of like professional meetings of biologists or earth scientists. I was at the Paris Climate Conference where they negotiated the global climate deal, performing there. And I go to conferences a lot. Outstanding. Okay. My follow-up question was, what is your hope of, where do you want to go from here? Well, I've over the past 5 or 6 years, I've been writing show after show, and I've done a series of off-Broadway shows. And I think the natural next step for it is like a TV or media broadcast platform where it's sort of like wrapping the big ideas or Rap Guide to the Universe or something like that. So I'm playing whatever angles I can play here in New York to try to get that show made, whether it's for web or hopefully on a network. That would be my ideal next step, is to make the transition that Will Smith made in the 90s from the fresh DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince to having a TV show where he could he was mostly just clowning on that show. But I feel like a lot of these ideas are important and unappreciated by the general public. And I advocate for this sort of like science and rationalism takeover of media and pop culture, but obviously I have a vested interest because I'm trying to push it as well with everything I do. So, get bigger audiences. That's my agenda.
Well, no, I'm terribly impressed when I meet people who are smarter than me and who are visibly smarter than me, and I appreciate I have a great deal of respect for academics, for example, and so I'm all about this cultural change where we want to elevate people's understanding of the way that things really are, because it's what should be. Whereas, of course, we know that the religious right want people to be dumbed down and want them to be just as deluded as they are, and so that their kids don't know anything any better than they do, and that's a dangerous situation. I'm speaking primarily for the culture here in Texas and in the South, where things are particularly bad as far as the United States goes. I'd like to see things improve much the way you are, and I hope to work with you at some point to that end.
I'd like that very much as well. Keep fighting the good fight.
You too. All right. So I'm going to let you close any last statements, and I'm going to push the button, sir.
All right. I just say to your listeners, if you've never listened to me before, you probably have, you're speculating about what this rap could possibly sound like. That's about science and reason and psychology and the world of ideas. And, don't speculate. Go listen. Check it out for yourself. And if you like it, spread it to a friend.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, and good night, everybody.